Hi CEBC Youth, Jordan Loveless here to bring you this week's Sunday School lesson, focus on honoring life. And our basic principle here is that we are called to respect human life in all of its forms, from the very beginning of it to the very end. And we do that because God values life. The Bible tells us that we are made in God's image. And there is a theological principle called the Imago Dei. I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, but basically it is just focused on the fact that all life, all human life is made in God's image, and therefore it inherently holds 20% of battery remaining. Good. Okay, well, we're just going to close that and hope that we make it the whole way, friends. Imago Dei is just the concept that we should have a great and utmost respect for human life because we are all made in God's image. So let's dive in, and our first verse is pretty simple and straightforward. We are coming from that great message, or that great commandment, time of commandments that was delivered to Moses on Mount Sinai from the burning bush, God himself. Exodus 20:13, the sixth commandment. Anybody? Bueller? No? Okay. Do not murder. Simple, straightforward. In our culture, and I think throughout the world, people have lots of different perspectives on right and wrong. That's something that is debated everywhere. Principles and values are taught from different viewpoints, and I think when people look at the Ten Commandments, they're a source of a lot of disagreement. First commandment, first of all, teaches that there is only one God. And as you all know, if you've been in the world or taken a world religions class, or, been alive, people will debate that to no end, that there are others but the one true God. The third commandment teaches that we are to honor God's name, but we all know that people throw that around carelessly. Even people who call themselves Christians will use the Lord's name in vain. The fourth commandment, remember the Sabbath, is not taken seriously very often. And I think we can go down the list and look at a lot of things in our culture that would really go against a lot of the Ten Commandments. But the one commandment that's pretty much, I think, universally accepted would be this sixth commandment, or I hope so. Murder is wrong. However, life and the value of that life have never been more discussed and debated than in these recent years and in our culture today. Whether the topic is abortion, euthanasia, human trafficking, abuse, bullying. I think it's very important for us to understand what the Bible has to say about life, and take that in and really work to defend God's standards and how we treat others. So we find ourselves at Mount Sinai, and the people of Israel listening to the Lord's words from the Ten Commandments, which emphasize how these were directions from God that emphasize how we were supposed to live in relation to other people. So this whole book of the Bible is our directions, is a blueprint for God's people to live in a kingdom-minded way. And those Ten Commandments were those first messages from God to his people on how to live. And then we're going to move on to see several hundred years later, David, who God had chosen as the next king of Israel, still living under the current king Saul's reign, and how he obeyed this command, even though King Saul sought to kill him. But let's put a pin in that. We'll be there in a minute. So, going back to Exodus 20:13, do not murder. Super simple. Human life is precious to God, and it should be precious to us. I think one of, we can all sit here and say, well, yeah, I've never murdered anybody. I can say that. I hope you can too. But we also get the false notion that just because we haven't taken part in that actual physical act of murder ourselves, that we would be above that 3-word command, do not murder. Oh yeah, well, I'm good. I've never done that. However, if we look at Matthew 5:21 and 22, Jesus makes it clear in his teachings in the Sermon on the Mount that murder can take other forms. Ooh, let that sit with you. People can destroy others' lives with hate or cruel words and other actions. He says, again, Matthew 5:21 and 22, you have heard that it was said to our ancestors, do not murder, and whoever murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you, everyone who is angry with his brother or sister will become subject to judgment. Whoever insults his brother or sister will be subject to the court. Whoever says, you fool, will be subject to hellfire. Yeah, we can all say, I've never murdered anybody, but can we all say, I've never been angry with my brother or sister, been bitter about something that they've done to me. I've never talked or backbited? I've never talked about someone behind their backs. I can't say that. Basically, what Jesus is telling us is those are equivalent in God's eyes. When we treat God's creation as less than, it's the same as murdering. I bet you guys are thinking, whoa, that's extreme. But it's not. Jesus is trying to make a point. In everything that he is doing, he came to show the people how to live in a kingdom way. He came to bring on a revolution, essentially. People have been getting it wrong for centuries, even though they had been given God's word. And so he came to live it out and call us to live out a life of love for others. He says in John 13:34, I give you a new command, love one another. Just as I have loved you, you are also to love one another. And so anytime we live without love for one another, we're living in disobedience to God's highest command. The world responds to people in circumstances they don't appreciate very harshly, with anger or unforgiveness. I mean, you see it on social media all the time. Just the goodness, the hatred that is all over the place. But we as Christians are called to be different. We can disagree in peace. We can still love people, even though they might hold opinions that are different than ours. And I think it's super important in this political environment to remember that love is above all. Forgiveness and grace are about so much more than forgiving the person that has hurt you, or forgiving the person that disagrees with you or is hateful to you. When we choose to remain bitter and hold on to that hatred, it damages us more than it does other people, and that prevents us from loving people well. Even worse, it brings dishonor to the name of God and what God is all about, which is love. I think this is far easier said than done, but very important for us, especially in this day and age, again, to try and cultivate a heart that is not so easily offended, and to love people so much that even though they may say unkind things to us, and they may disagree with us to a great point, that our love for them goes beyond any offense. Again, that's really hard to do, and something that, quite frankly, humans cannot do without the grace of God. And so we really have to lean heavily on Jesus for that. But I assure you, he'll be there for it. Let's see. So let's jump in and see how King David lived out this commandment and honored life, even when he was pretty much set up not to. So 1 Samuel 26, 7 through 11 says, that night David and Abishai came to the troops, and Saul was lying there asleep in the inner circle of the camp with his spear stuck in the ground right by his head, like, kill me, ready. Abner and his troops were lying around him. Then, I'm butchering this, Abishai said to David, today God has delivered your enemy to you. Let me thrust the spear through him into the ground just once. I won't have to strike him twice. Like, basically, he's like, dude, David, he's here. He's like, it would be so easy to kill him. Let's just do it. Let's go for it. But David said to Abishai, don't destroy him, for who can lift a hand against the Lord's anointed and be innocent? David added, as the Lord lives, the Lord will certainly strike him down. Either his day will come and he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. However, because of the Lord, I will never lift my hand against the Lord's anointed. Instead, take the spear and the water jug by his head, and let's go. So here's some background that you need to know. As I said earlier, Saul is the current king. David and Saul both know that David is the next up and coming king. God has already delivered that message, and Saul is not happy about it. And at this point, Saul has already threatened David within the palace. I mean, basically, like, tried to murder him right then and there, and David was like swift and he dodged it. And David dodged it and headed out. And at this point, Saul has been pursuing David. So there's like armies involved. David is basically like running from Saul. And Saul's after him to kill him because, he doesn't want him to take his throne. We see here that David has pretty much come upon Saul in a really vulnerable state, and he could have just ended it right then and there. But because David honors God and honors God's commandments, he says, no, we're not going to do this. We're not going to take advantage of it right here. David's choice to honor life is a powerful lesson, I think, in this story. Again, it says that life is sacred and that no one has the right to take a life other than the creator of life himself, God. In Genesis 9:6, God makes a super important statement to Noah, which helps us understand that God holds life as sacred. He says, whoever sheds human blood, by humans his blood will be shed, for God made humans in his image. All people are made in the image of God. Again, that Imago Dei. And to take the life of one another at any stage of life is not only an attack on that person, it's an attack on God himself. God is the only one with the right to give life. And so, well, not just the right, the ability to give life. And so he's the only one with the right to take it away. David's refusal to take Saul's life acknowledged God's ultimate authority over life and death, and he left the matter in God's hands. He said, you know what, either Saul's going to die naturally or Saul's going to run himself into battle and he'll die. It's not up to me to do this, or you, my henchman. Not henchman, I mean, he was like a soldier, he was a buddy or whatever. He was offering to do it for David, but David's like, no, don't do that. Let's not. We're going to honor life. And as Jesus' disciples, we can't grow complacent in a world where life is continually devalued and destroyed. In order for me to not turn this into an hour-long Sunday school lesson, I just want you guys to think about the ways that life has been devalued in our world, especially in this current climate. Oh gosh, 10% battery remaining. Whew, we gotta wrap it up, guys. I want you guys to think about that and think about your role in speaking out for the sanctity of human life and how you advocate for people, whether that's you standing up to someone who is bullying someone else, or you, choosing to support victims who have been abused in all sorts of manners, whether that be by the hand of someone specific or by the hands of their government. How do you protect human life, and how do you intend to continue protecting that human life as you gain more responsibility as adults? Something very important to think about as you grow. Let's follow David into where he's going. So 1 Samuel, we're going to pick back up. We're still in chapter 26. We're going to pick back up at verse 22. David answered, "Here's the king's spear. Have one of the young men come over and get it. The Lord will repay every man for his righteousness and his loyalty. I wasn't willing to lift my hand against the Lord's anointed, even though the Lord handed you over to me today. Just as I consider your life valuable today, so may the Lord consider my life valuable and rescue me from all trouble." Saul said to him, "You are blessed, my son David. You will certainly do great things and will also prevail." Then David went on his way, and Saul returned home. So, you remember that David said, "No, we're not going to do this. Grab his spear and his water jug here, and we're going to get out of here." So what he's done now is returned to King Saul and said, "Look, dude, I came upon you in your camp when you were asleep, and I had every opportunity to kill you. I have your spear and your water jug that was lying right next to you, right here, to prove it. Believe me." And guys, I want to tell you, this is not the only time that this happened. David was so close to Saul in another instance that he was able to cut a piece of cloth off of his robe to be like, "Look, Saul, I was able to kill you, but I chose not to, because I'm choosing to honor God." Can you hear my baby crying in the background? David is honoring God at every turn here. And we know that David was a man after God's own heart. We even see that Saul momentarily, because you guys, the story gets better. You just keep reading and you'll see how Saul just continues to go after David. But temporarily, he kind of has a change of heart here, and is like, "Well, okay, my son, I'll tell you about, you're going to do some great things in life." It struck him. So we see that we respect God, we honor God, and by respecting life, and treating every human life as infinitely and equally valuable. David modeled this in his interaction with Saul, and he hoped that Saul would do the same for him. Throughout much of his life, David modeled words that the prophet Micah would speak centuries later. And Micah 6:8 says, "He has shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." Justice means, in the most basic sense, to do or make right. We are always to treat others in ways that are right. Further, and most importantly, when the innocent or vulnerable suffer wrong treatment, we're called to help right those wrongs. We're called to advocate. We're called to use our voice and use the power that we've been given to stand up for the weak. And just because you might be young does not mean that you are not in a position to stand up for the weak and to defend someone. And that's something important to remember, because God empowers each one of us to do what honors him. Loving faithfulness. God calls us to live in faithful obedience to him. Further, faithful living requires us to faithfully show kindness and mercy to others as well. And walking humbly. People are often tempted to think that we are better than we are. Following following Christ means lowering ourselves, loving others as much or even more than we care about our own well-being. Humility is a hard thing for humans. I think that the curse of pride is something that Satan really likes to puff us up with. And it's hard to love people. We are hard to be. We're unlovable things. And so I think being humble and really asking God for humility is something that is so important in our mission to love people and to value life. And when we live that way, when we act justly, when we love mercy, when we walk humbly, we're living in a way that God intended for us to do. I would like to leave you with this question. How can you reflect Jesus in the ways that you value the lives of others? Again, we remember that Christ came to show us a new way of living all those years ago. Christ came to show the culture in that day that there was more to their faith than their religion. That it wasn't just a set of rules and rituals that you were to follow that left out the humanity in all of this. Christ came to remind us of the image of God that we bear and the image of God that those around us bear, and called us to love one another and love that image of God within each other. So reflect on that, and I pray that you would value the lives of others the way that God does. Thanks, guys.